The oldest civilization? Prehistoric India, Mohenjo-daro, its antiquity. In the days when historians supposed that history had begun with Greece, Europe gladly believed that India had been a hotbed of barbarism until the Aryan cousins of the European peoples had migrated from the shores of the Caspian to bring the arts and sciences to a savage and benighted peninsula. Recent researchers have marred this comforting picture, as future researchers will change the perspective of these pages. In India, as elsewhere, the beginnings of civilization are buried in the earth, and not all the spades of archaeology will ever quite exhume them. Remains of an old Stone Age fill many cases in the museums of Calcutta, Madras, and Bombay, and Neolithic objects have been found in nearly every state. These, however, were cultures, not yet a civilization. In 1924, the world of scholarship was again aroused by news from India. Sir John Marshall announced that his Indian aides, R.D. Banerjee in particular, had discovered at Mohenjo-daro, on the western bank of the lower Indus, remains of what seemed to be an older civilization than any yet known to historians. There, and at Harappa, a few hundred miles to the north, 4 or 5 superimposed cities were excavated, with hundreds of solidly built brick houses and shops, ranged along wide streets as well as narrow lanes, and rising in many cases to several stories. Let Sir John estimate the age of these remains. Quote, "These discoveries established the existence in Sind and the Punjab during the 4th and 3rd millennium BC of a highly developed city life, and the presence in many of the houses of wells and bathrooms as well as an elaborate drainage system all betoken a social condition of the citizens at least equal to that found in Sumer and superior to that prevailing in contemporary Babylonia and Egypt. Even at Ur, the houses are by no means equal in point of construction to those at Mohenjo-daro." End quote. Among the finds at these sites were household utensils and toilet outfits, pottery painted in plain, hand-turned and turned on the wheel, terracottas, dice, and chessmen, coins older than any previously known, over 1,000 seals, most of them engraved and inscribed in an unknown pictographic script, faience work of excellent quality, stone carving superior to that of the Sumerians, copper weapons and implements, and a copper model of a 2-wheeled cart, one of our oldest examples of a wheeled vehicle. Also, gold and silver bangles, ear ornaments, necklaces, and other jewelry so well finished and so highly polished, says Marshall, that they might have come out of a Bond Street jeweler's of today, rather than from a prehistoric house of 5,000 years ago. Strange to say, the lowest strata of these remains showed a more developed art than the upper layers, as if even the most ancient deposits were from a civilization already hundreds, perhaps thousands of years old. Some of the implements were of stone, some of copper, some of bronze, suggesting that this Indus culture had arisen in a Chalcolithic age, i.e., in a transition from stone to bronze as the material of tools. The indications are that Mohenjo-daro was at its height when Cheops built the first Great Pyramid, that it had commercial, religious, and artistic connections with Sumeria and Babylonia, and that it survived over 3,000 years, until the 3rd century before Christ. The connections with Sumeria and Babylonia are suggested by similar seals found at Mohenjo-daro and in Sumeria, especially at Kish, and by the appearance of the naga, or hooded serpent, among the early Mesopotamian seals. In 1932, Dr. Henry Frankfurt unearthed in the ruins of a Babylonian Elamite city at the modern Tel Asmar near Baghdad, pottery and seals and beads which in his judgment, Sir John Marshall concurring, were imported from Mohenjo-daro circa 2000 BC. MacDonald believes that this amazing civilization of Mohenjo-daro was derived from Sumeria. Hall believes that the Sumerians derived their culture from India. Woolley derives both the Sumerians and the early Hindus from some common parent stock and culture in or near Baluchistan. Investigators have been struck by the fact that similar seals, found both in India and Babylonia, belong to the earliest pre-Sumerian phase of the Mesopotamian culture, but to the latest phase of the Indus civilization, which suggests the priority of India. Childe inclines to this conclusion. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, the material culture of Abydos, Ur, and Mohenjo-daro would stand comparison with that of Heraclean Athens, or of any medieval town. Judging by the domestic architecture, the seal cutting, and the grace of the pottery, the Indus civilization was ahead of the Babylonian at the beginning of the 3rd millennium. But that was a late phase of the Indian culture. It may have enjoyed no less lead in earlier times. Were then the innovations and discoveries that characterize Proto-Sumerian civilization not native developments on Babylonian soil, but the results of Indian inspiration? If so, had the Sumerians themselves come from the Indus, or at least from regions in its immediate sphere of influence? These fascinating questions cannot yet be answered, but they serve to remind us that a history of civilization, because of our human ignorance, begins at what was probably a late point in the actual development of culture. We cannot tell yet whether, as Marshall believes, Mohenjo-daro represents the oldest of all civilizations known. But the exhuming of prehistoric India has just begun. Only in our time has archaeology turned from Egypt across Mesopotamia to India. When the soil of India has been turned up like that of Egypt, we shall probably find there a civilization older than that which flowered out of the mud of the Nile.